Hello everybody, and thank you for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, and most of you know that Daniel is the Executive Director of the Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Daniel, good to have you here today.
Good to be with you, Dr. Paul.
Daniel, we have a special guest today, a senior editor of Reason Magazine, who's the expert, one of the many experts on civil liberties, and he writes about this frequently. And this is Jacob Sullum, and he has recently written about, which seems at times to be complex, but it's getting more attention all the time, and that has to do with the Hammonds, who have just recently, it looks like, been resentenced, and it seems like a very complicated mess. And Jacob, I want to thank you very much for being with us today, and we're looking forward to you sorting out all these issues dealing with the Hammonds.
Thank you for having me.
Well, good. First off, give our viewers sort of a brief summary. There's some people who sort of have heard about the Hammonds and something's going on Oregon. Tell us a little bit about what has happened and why you're interested in this case.
Well, the case struck me because of the way that it illustrates the problems with mandatory minimum sentencing. What happened in this case is you have a couple of ranchers, of father and son, who set controlled fires, two of them, one in 2001, one in 2006. They said the first one was aimed at controlling invasive juniper trees and other invasive species. And the second one was aimed at preventing the spread of a wildfire that had been ignited by lightning. They were worried that it would get onto their property and destroy their winter feed. So that the second one was a backburn. Both of these fires spread to federal land. It's kind of hard to avoid that. Their ranch is right in the middle of federal land, interspersed with it. The first fire destroyed, altogether they destroyed 139 acres, burnt 139 acres. One of the fires was about an acre and the other one was 138. And that may sound like a lot, but to put it into context, this is a ranch of about 10,000 acres, and it's interspersed with federal land that totals several times as much acreage. So really, it's a very tiny percentage of this area. Furthermore, the amount of property damage, very hard to estimate because they're basically burning out the juniper trees and the scrub. The jury in this case determined that the property damage in total was less than $2,000. The judge who sentenced them thought that perhaps, if you could put a dollar figure on it, the damage might total more than $100, but he couldn't really say. And he said, and really, whatever injury had been done had been repaired through natural processes. The Bureau of Land Management said that, in fact, the larger fire had improved the federal land that it affected because it got rid of the juniper trees and the scrub, and it improved it in terms of as pasture land. Basically, the damage they did was not that great. They did not get the permission that they were supposed to get from the feds, which is why, or one of the reasons anyway, that the Justice Department went after them. But does not seem like a huge crime with a lot of victims. No one was injured. There was no property aside from the vegetation that was destroyed. The judge took all that into account, and in sentencing them, he decided, he looked at the guidelines, the federal sentencing guidelines, and basically picked sentences within the ranges recommended by the guidelines. And so the father, who was convicted in connection with one of the fires, got 3 months, and the son, who was convicted in connection with two of the fires, got a year. But the problem is that there is a mandatory minimum associated with the offense that they were convicted for. And this is an offense under federal law that is actually the way they describe it is the destruction of federal property through fire, among other means. So if you blow up a federal building, or if you burn down a federal building, this provision would apply. It was the five-year mandatory minimum was added by a piece of terrorism legislation. So it seems to be aimed at deliberate arsonists, and furthermore, specifically at terrorists. These ranchers really do not qualify for that label, but they were convicted under that provision. And legally, the 5-year mandatory minimum applies. The judge thought that it would be grossly unfair to impose that sentence, and in fact, he argued that it was a constitutional violation, that it amounted to cruel and unusual punishment because it was grossly disproportionate. And so he said, I'm not going to apply the 5-year mandatory minimum. That would be a clear miscarriage of justice. It would shock the conscience. Instead, I'm going to give you the sentences you would get if only the guidelines applied. Now, the government appealed, which is pretty routine. The government can appeal these sentences if they feel the judge is not imposing the correct sentence. And the Federal Appeals Court, the Ninth Circuit, said, you know what, the prosecutors are right. The judge should have imposed the mandatory minimum. And what ended up happening is that the Hammonds served their original sentences. They were all done with that. And then they had to go back to federal prison. And in fact, they reported just this past Monday to a federal prison in California. Mm-hmm. So they're now going to have to serve out the balance of 5-year sentences.
Right.
And that's what people were really upset about. And that was the protest on Saturday that from which this group of people who took over the buildings at the nature preserve slid off.
You know, we have a lot of examples, and you've written about them, the examples of mandatory sentencing for other reasons, and they're outrageous, and the judges are, you know, in a trap, and they do get sentenced and they serve out their time. Now this one is a little bit different because the judge lowered the sentence, and then there was a new sentencing. And is it correct that the Hammonds are back in prison as of this month?
Yes, they reported back on Monday.
Right.
So they've already gone back. They, by the way, have distanced themselves from the occupation of the buildings at the nature preserve. Even though the Bundys say that they're protesting on their behalf, the Hammonds say we don't really want to have anything to do with that. And a lot of people are turned off by the tactics used by the Bundys and their followers. But that shouldn't distract people from the fact that there really is an injustice here, and it represents a much wider injustice that comes about because you have these laws that prescribe penalties without regard to context, without regard to what's really going on. I mean, if you can't distinguish between somebody who accidentally sets fire to federal land, doesn't really cause that much damage, and a terrorist who burns down, you know, a federal building, then you have a real problem.
Right. Do you have any other examples of resentencing like this? We have the abuse of minimal sentencing, but have you seen this or know of cases where this has occurred before, where they get resentenced and they just get thrown back in after they've served what the judge issued as the sentence?
Well, I think it's probably fairly unusual that they would actually have completed their sentences before they get the new longer sentence. But it is fairly common for the prosecution to appeal and say that the sentence was not according to law, and that it should be reconsidered. Even under the guidelines, which are no longer mandatory but are advisory, judges, if they want to depart from the guidelines, are supposed to give a written explanation for why they're doing that, and then the Justice Department can say, we don't agree with that reasoning, and we think, in fact, the sentence should be longer, and sometimes they win in cases like that. So that particular maneuver is not really unusual. I think people might have gotten the impression that it was. It seems sort of weird that you would serve a sentence and then go back and serve a sentence again for the same crime, but in fact, that sort of thing happens pretty frequently, that the Justice Department is not happy with the sentence imposed by a judge and tries to get it lengthened.
Okay, I want to ask. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
No, one striking thing about this case is the prosecutor who asked for the mandatory minimum himself conceded that this was troubling. That was the word he used. It's troubling that what they did and the sentence that they're getting, or the sentence that's prescribed by law, does not really seem proportional. He himself conceded that, even while he was saying, really, you have no choice but to impose this mandatory minimum. So I think that's pretty striking. You don't often get that sort of concession from a prosecutor.
Okay, I have one more question at this moment, and Daniel's going to have a question for you. But these minimum sentencing laws, the problem that we have with them, are they essentially always federal? Or if we had no federal mandatory sentencing laws and a strict interpret the Constitution, they'd probably be out of this business. But are there state laws that do the same thing, this
Yes.
minimum sentencing?
Yeah, I mean, there are many mandatory minimum statutes at the state level. Some states, including Texas, have moved to reduce sentences and have alternatives to prison for certain classes of drug offenders, for example. But one of the biggest problems is repeat offender laws, which are supposedly designed to target the most dangerous criminals. But what ends up happening is if you have committed a couple of felonies over the course of your life, you can end up going to prison for the rest of your life. You can actually get a life sentence for very trivial crimes. And in fact, the Ninth Circuit in the Hammond case said, we don't think that the 5-year mandatory minimum imposed on them is grossly disproportionate. And here's how we know. Look at all these other ridiculously long sentences that have been upheld by the Supreme Court. And a bunch of those were sentences imposed under these habitual criminal laws or repeat offender laws where they're supposedly targeting the worst of the worst, but it ends up that some guy steals some golf clubs and he goes to prison for 50 years over the rest of his life. Somebody commits a minor drug offense, but because it's his third strike, he goes away for decades or for life. And in California recently, the voters there passed a reform that dials back their 3 strikes law so that you don't have these really egregious injustices where somebody commits a really minor offense and gets a really mind-boggling punishment for it. So there have been some moves toward dialing that back, but that remains a problem, and people can end up serving life sentences for nonviolent crimes, which is really astonishing.
And when we do know of some cases with IRS infractions, they've gotten essentially life in sentences for that as well. Daniel, what do you have for Jacob?
Well, Jacob, thanks for joining us, and thanks for bringing to light a different aspect of this, and unfortunately it's not covered as much as it should be in the mainstream media, if at all.
Right.
And if you are a casual observer looking at this event, you would see the focus on the armed standoff. And sadly, for we civil libertarians, our friends on the left and the right are sort of falling into their natural camp. The right is celebrating the gun culture and taking on the government with guns. And the left, sadly enough, and including, I'm sure many of our otherwise allies, are saying, well, the police hassled a lot of African Americans in Ferguson. Why aren't they out there hassling the whites in Oregon? Instead of asking the right question, which is why are they hassling any of these people at all?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that was striking to me as well. Sometimes it feels like they're saying there should be equal injustice. Everybody should be treated equally unfairly, and then we will have, a just society. But that makes no sense. I mean, what you should be striving to do is, to the extent that they're showing a certain amount of restraint in Oregon, and I think so far the police are. Both the federal government and the state and local governments are showing restraint. That's appropriate, and you should ask not why is that happening here, but why doesn't that happen elsewhere? I think the feds in particular learned a lesson after Ruby Ridge and Waco, and they don't want to create make these prophecies of confrontation self-fulfilling, where they go in and enforce and that just escalates the situation and leads to the loss of life. They are wisely trying to avoid that, and I think people on the left should welcome the restraint, and then it's legitimate to ask in other situations where police are not so restrained, which of course happens with some frequency, why not? Why did they have to go in with guns blazing? Right. Why did they have to shoot this guy or shoot him so quickly? Why didn't they hang back and try to evaluate the situation? These questions come up pretty often these days, and they're perfectly fair to ask, but when you see police doing what you want them to do, you shouldn't say, why don't they go in there with their guns blazing?
Well, the frustration of the American people today with government is pretty strong, and I think that's very healthy. But the solutions are very difficult. I think I know what the solutions are, but to overcome what exists in Washington, D.C. and what exists in the judicial system and how much clout they have and how much unlimited amounts of money to prosecute people, it really is pretty frustrating how to come up with a solution. But at the origin of our country, there was a concept that was well understood and endorsed called jury nullification. And sometimes I think that's the only thing left for us when I look at the bureaucracy. Do you give the issue of jury nullification any credibility as a part of a solution for some of this runaway problems that we have on sentencings? If the jurors only knew, that they could have more say in the judgment of the law.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, jurors do not know what the penalty is that awaits the defendant, and that's deliberate. The prosecution doesn't want them to know. There have been a bunch of cases where jurors have said after the fact, if we knew that he was facing a 5-year mandatory minimum or a 10-year mandatory minimum or 50 years in federal prison for a series of minor marijuana sales, we never would have convicted him. So I think it would make a big difference if people knew that, and whether or not prosecutors like it, juries clearly have the power, and there's a long-standing tradition of juries exercising that power to not only judge the facts of the case, but also the law, and to say, we understand that the law says this guy should go to prison for 10 years or 20 years, but we think that's patently unjust, and so we're not going to allow it. I would like to see more of that. Unfortunately, jurors don't always know what the consequences of their verdict are going to be. And sometimes the government will go after activists who try to inform them about their power to judge the law as well as the facts of the case. There have been a few cases recently where people handing out brochures near courthouses have been arrested in Denver, most strikingly, and charged with felonies, jury tampering, simply because they're trying to inform people about the right of jurors to judge the law as well as the facts of the case. They're handing out pamphlets. You would think that that would be protected by the First Amendment, and in fact it is, but that doesn't stop certain prosecutors and certain police officers from trying to intimidate activists. These charges typically will end up being dropped or dismissed, but of course the message has already been sent that you shouldn't exercise your right to free speech if you want to avoid being hassled by the police. Right. So that's unfortunate. I do see jury nullification as a potential partial solution, but there's no way it's ever going to have the sort of impact that you could have by passing sentencing reform. There's legislation that's being considered by Congress right now that would substantially reduce a lot of federal drug penalties. The encouraging thing about that is that it is supported by Republicans and Democrats. It's supported even by some people who usually are very gung-ho drug warriors. It does not go as far as I would like, but it would definitely be an improvement. My hope is that situations like this, where you have a couple of people who face a really excessive sentence, but are not your average crack dealer or pot grower, that will attract sympathy from conservatives who otherwise don't give this much thought.
Right. I think Daniel has
I was just going to follow up by saying, the land of the free, it's really a pragmatic issue. We have the largest prison population on earth, both per capita and in real terms, and that includes countries like China, which everyone assumes is a police state. So just a pragmatic issue. I think it's a great point, Jacob, that if some of the people that conservatives might consider allies unfortunately have to suffer, it might wake them up just to the pragmatic issue of spending how many untold billions of dollars keeping peaceful Americans in cages.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the money issue is part of the reason why there is increasing support for sentencing reform. The fact that crime rates are declining definitely helps. The fact that there doesn't seem to be any measurable reward for locking up more and more and more people for longer and longer periods of time. That the evidence suggests that that for real crime where you have people that you are committing predatory offenses that you're really afraid of, that the main thing is that they, for deterrence, that they have a high likelihood of being caught and that they are punished relatively swiftly. That the length of the sentence is not really the crucial part. And to my mind, all the people who are locked up for things like drug offenses that are not true crimes shouldn't be serving any time at all. But certainly if they're serving, a couple of years rather than 10 years, that's an improvement.
Right.
So, and I know, your son is trying to do something about that, and it's admirable the way he's brought attention to this issue, and it's very encouraging that he's gotten allies both within his party and among the Democrats.
Right. Jacob, we got to go, but I want to thank you very much for being with us today. This interesting discussion is going to be in the news for a while, so keep up on it and keep writing about it, and I think more and more people will be paying attention. Hopefully we'll come up with a solution.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. I want to go ahead and close with a word to the viewers, because I think this is a key issue, and it brings up the subject we talked about, reforms, sentencing reform. And Jacob obviously thinks that's very, very important, and I do too, and hopefully we can deal with that. But Daniel alluded to the fact that why are there so many prisoners? Well, it's because there are too many laws. And you know, if you look at the Constitution, there's about 5 or 6 things that could be construed in this strict sense as being a federal law. But we have thousands and thousands of pages, so that's one thing, is we have too many laws, and that goes for the state and local authorities too. So we need a lot less laws, and we need a lot more self-governance and local government rather than looking to just having more laws to mold economic behavior and mold personal behavior. But ultimately, another thing that we didn't get the chance to touch on, but I think it's very important, and that has to do with private property ownership. When nobody owns the property and everybody owns the property, and you have contracts with the government, and our government is untrustworthy, it started out with our contracts with the Indians. They were never upheld, and now we make contracts with people who live and graze off federal land. You know, if the Bundys happened to have been an oil company in a fight with the federal government, they would have at least had some funds to fight them. But no, they pick on the little guy, and they want to erode the principle. I believe these individuals that push this, they are avowed socialists. They want government ownership. They do not believe in private ownership. So we would have a lot less problem, but we could start off. I know that a third of the country is owned by the federal government. We can't achieve that overnight, but we could certainly move in the direction that as much as possible, land control should be delivered back to the states and then delivered to the private sector. When you think about it, a state like Oklahoma and a state like Texas, the land was always owned by the individuals. There's essentially no federal land in Texas, and natural resources were handled quite well. Private property is a principle that can deal with all our civil liberties as well, so we should pay attention to that. But once again, I want to thank all our listeners for tuning in today, and I hope this subject was of interest to you, and please come back and visit the Liberty Report soon.